October 27th, 1899, Millbrook, Massachusetts. The autumn fog rolled thick through the narrow streets of this forgotten New England village, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and something else, something that would haunt the memories of those who lived through that cursed evening. In the parlor of the Blackwood family home on Elm Street, a photographer named Silas Pendleton carefully arranged his equipment, preparing to capture what would become one of the most disturbing images in photographic history. The Blackwood funeral should have been unremarkable. Ezra Blackwood, the family patriarch, had passed quietly in his sleep at the age of 73. His widow, Martha, stood surrounded by her 5 children and their families, all dressed in the somber blacks and grays that propriety demanded. The mahogany casket rested open in the center of the room, adorned with white lilies that seemed to glow ghostly pale in the dim gaslight. Silas Pendleton was known throughout Essex County for his funeral portraits. His steady hands and keen eye had immortalized hundreds of the departed, creating lasting memories for grieving families. He approached his work with clinical precision, measuring distances, calculating exposure times, adjusting his large-format camera with the methodical care of a surgeon. Nothing was ever left to chance in a Pendleton photograph. The family gathered around their beloved patriarch, arranging themselves in the traditional formation, the widow at the head of the casket, children flanking either side, grandchildren positioned carefully in the foreground. The scene appeared perfectly ordinary, a tableau of grief and remembrance that had been repeated countless times in parlors across America. Martha Blackwood's tear-stained face reflected the sorrow of a woman who had lost her companion of 47 years. The children, ranging from 25 to 43 years old, maintained the stoic composure expected of their station. Pendleton ducked beneath his black cloth, peering through the lens with practiced concentration. The composition was flawless, the lighting adequate despite the gathering dusk outside. He counted slowly to himself, ensuring perfect stillness would become the center of a mystery that would challenge everything they believed about life, death, and the thin veil that separates the two worlds. Hidden within those silver halide crystals was an image that defied explanation. A presence that had not been in that room. A figure that would haunt not only the surviving family members, but everyone who dared to look closely enough to see what should not have been there. The photograph appeared normal at first glance, just as thousands of funeral portraits had before it. Yet within its seemingly innocent frame lurked something that would transform a simple act of remembrance into a gateway to questions that human understanding was never meant to confront. This is the story of that photograph, and the terrible truth that lay hidden in its shadows for over 2 decades, a truth that would ultimately consume everyone who sought to uncover it. To understand the magnitude of what transpired in that Millbrook parlor, one must first comprehend the world in which it occurred. The year 1899 stood at the precipice of a new century, a moment suspended between the gaslit certainties of the Victorian age and the electric uncertainties of the modern era. America balanced on the knife's edge of transformation, where horse-drawn carriages shared muddy roads with the first sputtering automobiles, where candlelit evening prayers gave way to the harsh glare of Edison's incandescent bulbs. The Industrial Revolution had fundamentally altered the rhythm of American life. Factory whistles now marked the hours instead of church bells, and families that had worked the same land for generations found themselves crowded into tenement buildings in rapidly expanding cities. Yet, in small towns like Millbrook, the old ways persisted with stubborn determination. Here, the seasons still dictated the pace of life, and death remained an intimate domestic affair, rather than the sanitized, institutional process it would later become. Photography itself was barely 60 years old, still regarded with a mixture of wonder and suspicion by many rural Americans. The ability to capture and preserve a moment in time seemed almost supernatural to those who had grown up with only painted portraits and daguerreotypes. Early cameras, clothing. But 1899 was also the height of the spiritualist movement in America. Mediums and seances had become fashionable entertainment in drawing rooms from Boston to San Francisco, as grieving families sought communication with their departed loved ones. The Fox sisters had ignited this supernatural fervor 50 years earlier with their mysterious spirit rappings. And by century's end, millions of Americans believed firmly in the possibility of contact between the living and the dead. This widespread fascination with the afterlife created a fertile ground for what became known as spirit photography. Unscrupulous photographers claimed their cameras could capture the souls of the dead, producing images that showed ghostly figures hovering near their living relatives. Most of these were obvious frauds, created through double exposure or deliberate manipulation of the photographic plates. Yet the public's hunger for proof of life beyond death made such images wildly popular, regardless of their authenticity. New England, with its Puritan heritage and centuries-old graveyards, proved particularly susceptible to supernatural beliefs. The region's long, harsh winters fostered a brooding spirituality that embraced both salvation and damnation with equal intensity. Ghost stories were passed down through generations like family heirlooms, and even the most rational citizens found themselves glancing nervously at shadows on moonless nights. In this atmosphere of rapid change and spiritual uncertainty, death took on heightened significance. The old certainties about heaven and hell were being challenged by new scientific discoveries and philosophical movements. Darwin's theories had shaken the foundations of biblical literalism, while advances in medicine began to demystify the process of dying itself. Yet, paradoxically, these same advances made death seem more final, more absolute, creating an even greater hunger for evidence that consciousness survived the grave. The photographic process itself seemed to offer tantalizing possibilities for such evidence. The camera captured details invisible to the naked eye, revealing textures, lifted another yellowed document from the dusty cardboard box. As the newly appointed curator of the Millbrook Historical Society, he had spent the past 3 months cataloging the accumulated detritus of 2 centuries of small-town life. The basement storage room contained a bewildering array of artifacts: Civil War memorabilia, faded daguerreotypes, handwritten letters tied with ribbon, and countless other remnants of lives long forgotten. The box he examined that crisp March morning had been donated by the estate of Mrs. Eleanor Thatcher, the town's former postmistress, who had passed away the previous winter at the remarkable age of 97. Mrs. Thatcher had been something of a pack rat, preserving everything from grocery receipts to funeral programs with equal dedication. Most of the contents appeared to be of minimal historical value, but Whitmore's training as a historian had taught him that significance often lurked in the most mundane documents. Near the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of black velvet that had seen better days, he discovered a large photographic plate. The glass negative was approximately 8 by 10 inches, carefully preserved in a protective envelope that bore the embossed mark of S. Pendleton, photographer, Millbrook, Mass. Whitmore held the plate up to the basement's single electric bulb, squinting to make out the reversed image captured in the silver halides. What he saw was a typical funeral portrait from the turn of the century. A family gathered around an open casket, their faces bearing the solemn expressions appropriate to such occasions. The photographer had arranged them with professional skill, creating a composition that was both respectful and artistically pleasing. Whitmore had seen hundreds of similar images in his academic work, and nothing about this particular photograph struck him as unusual. However, accompanying the photographic plate was a manila folder containing several handwritten letters and a printed obituary from the Millbrook Gazette, dated November 2nd, 1899. The obituary identified the deceased as Ezra Blackwood, described as a respected farmer and devoted family man, who will be great. Photograph, partially obscured by shadows, near what appeared to be a doorway, stood a figure that seemed oddly out of place. The person, if indeed it was a person, appeared to be wearing clothing that did not match the formal funeral attire of the identified family members. More strangely, the figure seemed somehow less solid than the other subjects, as if partially transparent or out of focus, despite being roughly the same distance from the camera. Whitmore completed the printing process and examined the finished photograph under bright electric light. The mysterious figure remained clearly visible, though frustratingly indistinct. It appeared to be an adult of medium height, but the facial features were impossible to discern due to deep shadows and what looked like intentional concealment. Most puzzling of all, the figure seemed to be positioned in a part of the room where, according to the composition of the other subjects, no one should have been standing. Driven by scholarly curiosity, Whitmore began researching the Blackwood family history. The town records revealed that Ezra Blackwood had indeed died on October 25, 1899, survived by his wife Martha and 5 children. The family had been prominent in local affairs, owning a substantial farm on the outskirts of town and participating actively in community organizations. Nothing in the official record suggested anything unusual about the family or circumstances of Ezra's death. However, Whitmore's investigation led him to discover that Mrs. Sarah Blackwood Morton, Ezra's youngest daughter, was still living in a nursing home in nearby Salem. At 87 years old, she was one of the few surviving witnesses to her father's funeral and the taking of the mysterious photograph. Whitmore arranged to visit her, hoping that her memories might shed light on the enigmatic figure captured in the family portrait. Mrs. Morton received him in the nursing home's sunlit parlor, her mind remarkably sharp despite her advanced age. When Whitmore showed her the photograph, her reaction was immediate and unsettling. Her face paled, and her hands began to tremble as she examined the image. The mysterious figure in the photograph, and Whitmore sensed that she was withholding information that she found deeply disturbing. As he prepared to leave, Mrs. Morton grasped his arm with surprising strength. "Dr. Whitmore," she said urgently, "perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Perhaps some doors are meant to stay closed." Her warning would prove more prophetic than either of them could have imagined. Dr. Whitmore returned to Millbrook with more questions than answers. But Mrs. Morton's reaction had convinced him that the photograph deserved serious investigation. He decided to consult with Professor Marcus Ashford, a colleague from Harvard University who specialized in early American photography and had considerable experience with photographic analysis and authentication. Professor Ashford arrived in Millbrook on a gray April morning, carrying a leather satchel filled with magnifying glasses, chemical testing solutions, and other tools of his trade. He had built his reputation on debunking fraudulent spirit photographs, and Whitmore hoped that his expertise would provide a rational explanation for the mysterious figure in the Blackwood family portrait. The two men spent the morning in the Historical Society's basement, where Ashford subjected both the original glass plate and Whitmore's prints to meticulous examination. He began with the obvious possibilities, searching for evidence of double exposure, retouching, or other common methods used to create fake supernatural images. However, his initial findings were perplexing rather than conclusive. "The glass plate shows no signs of manipulation," Ashford announced after 2 hours of careful scrutiny. "The emulsion is original and undisturbed. There are no scratches, additions, or alterations that I can detect with standard analysis." He paused, adjusting his magnifying glass to examine a particular section of the image. "However, there are some unusual characteristics in the density patterns around this background figure." Using a technique called densitometry, Ashford measured the light and dark values in different areas of the photograph. In a normal image, objects at similar distances from the camera should show consistent density relationships. But the mysterious figure displayed density patterns that seemed to violate these basic photographic principles. Under oblique lighting, it seemed to fade and become more ghostly. This optical effect was consistent across both the original negative and all prints made from it, ruling out any tricks of printing or processing. The two scholars decided to seek additional technical opinions. They contacted Dr. Heinrich Weber, a German physicist and expert in optical phenomena, who was visiting Boston's Museum of Science. Dr. Weber agreed to examine the photograph using more sophisticated equipment than was available in Millbrook. Dr. Weber's analysis, conducted at his temporary laboratory in Boston, revealed even more puzzling characteristics. Using spectroscopic analysis, he discovered that the light reflected by the mysterious figure contained wavelengths that did not match the other subjects in the photograph. "It is as if this figure is illuminated by a different light source entirely," he reported to Whitmore and Ashford. Yet, there is no evidence of any additional lighting equipment being used during the exposure. Furthermore, Dr. Weber's measurements indicated that the figure cast shadows in directions that were inconsistent with the known light sources in the room. The shadows fell at angles that suggested illumination from impossible positions, creating what he termed geometrically implausible shadow vectors. His scientific training could not reconcile these findings with any known photographic or optical principles. Perhaps most unsettling of all was Dr. Weber's observation that the figure appeared to be positioned at a different focal distance than indicated by its apparent position in the room. Using mathematical calculations based on the camera's known focal length and aperture settings, he determined that the figure should have been significantly out of focus if it were actually standing where it appeared to be. Yet the image showed a level of detail and sharpness that suggested the figure was somehow closer to the camera than physically possible. As word of these findings began to spread within academic circles, the Blackwood photograph attracted attention from researchers with more esoteric interests. Dr. Margaret Thornley, a professor of anthropology at Wellesley College, who had studied supernatural beliefs in New England communities, requested permission to examine the image. Her analysis focused, and thresholds are considered liminal spaces where the boundaries between worlds become permeable. If one were attempting to create a convincing spirit photograph, this would be precisely where one would position the ghostly figure. However, Dr. Thornley's analysis also revealed details that argued against deliberate fraud. The figure's clothing, posture, and positioning contained subtle cultural markers that suggested authentic period knowledge that would have been difficult for a turn-of-the-century photographer to fake convincingly. Moreover, the technical sophistication required to create such an image using the photographic methods available in 1899 exceeded what most small-town photographers would have possessed. As the investigation deepened, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Every expert who examined the photograph found evidence that challenged their professional understanding. Yet none could definitively prove either fraud or authenticity. The image seemed to exist in a realm beyond conventional explanation, defying both scientific analysis and rational skepticism with equal determination. News of the mysterious Blackwood photograph began to attract attention beyond academic circles. By late summer of 1921, word had spread to the growing community of paranormal investigators and supernatural enthusiasts who saw in the image possible proof of life after death. Among those who arrived in Millbrook was Edmund Blackthorne, a self-proclaimed expert in psychical research who had investigated dozens of alleged supernatural phenomena across New England. Blackthorne differed from the academic researchers who had previously examined the photograph. Where they approached the mystery with scientific skepticism, he arrived with the conviction that the image represented genuine evidence of spirit manifestation. His investigation methods were correspondingly unorthodox, involving seances, psychic readings, and attempts to communicate directly with whatever presence the photograph might have captured. Working with a local medium named Mrs. Victoria Crow, Blackthorne conducted a series of seances in the basement of the Millbrook Historical Society, using the photograph as a focal point for attempted spirit communication. Accurate when checked against historical records, Jeremiah Blackwood had indeed existed and had died under circumstances that the local newspaper described as sudden and unexpected. He had been found dead in his cabin on October 31st, 1867, with no apparent cause of death. The local physician recorded the cause as failure of the heart, but family letters discovered in Mrs. Thatcher's papers suggested that Jeremiah's death had been preceded by weeks of strange behavior and claims that he was being visited by supernatural entities. Blackthorne's investigation revealed that Jeremiah had been deeply involved in spiritualist practices during the months before his death. He had reportedly attended seances, experimented with automatic writing, and claimed to possess the ability to communicate with deceased family members. Several witnesses described him as obsessed with the idea of proving that consciousness survived bodily death, to the point where his behavior became erratic and disturbing to those around him. More troubling still were the historical records indicating that Jeremiah had been experimenting with what he called photographic manifestation in the weeks before his death. Letters written to a friend in Boston described his attempts to capture images of spirits using a camera he had recently purchased. He claimed to have achieved some success in these experiments, producing photographs that showed unexplained figures and anomalous light patterns. Dr. Whitmore discovered that Jeremiah's camera and photographic equipment had been inherited by his brother Ezra following his death in 1867. This meant that the same camera used for Jeremiah's supernatural experiments might have been in the Blackwood family home at the time of Ezra's funeral, 32 years later, possibly influencing or contaminating the spiritual atmosphere of the location. The investigation took a more ominous turn when several of the researchers began reporting strange personal experiences. Professor Ashford complained of vivid nightmares, featuring the mysterious figure from the photograph, dreams in which the shadowy presence seemed to be trying to communicate urgent but incomprehensible messages. Dr. Weber reported that his own photographs, taken during his analysis of the Blackwood image, had begun showing unexplained anomalies, shadow figures and light patterns. The house that had once belonged to the Blackwood family complained of strange sounds and cold spots that had appeared shortly after news of the photograph investigation became public. Other neighbors described seeing shadowy figures walking through the old Blackwood property at dusk, always near the threshold of the house where Ezra's funeral had been held. The town's pastor, Reverend Thomas Millfield, became sufficiently concerned about these reports to investigate the matter himself. His examination of church records revealed that the Blackwood family had a complex relationship with organized religion, attending services regularly, but also harboring beliefs that many parishioners found troubling. Several entries in church meeting minutes from the 1860s described concerns about unholy practices and dabbling in dark arts associated with various family members. Most significantly, Reverend Millfield discovered that both Jeremiah and Ezra Blackwood had been members of a secretive group known as the Circle of Eternal Knowledge, which met regularly to explore spiritualist practices and attempt communication with the dead. The group had disbanded following Jeremiah's mysterious death in 1867, but several surviving members remained in the community and might possess knowledge about the family's supernatural interests. As autumn approached, the investigation had attracted a small but dedicated group of researchers, each contributing their expertise to understanding the photograph's mysteries. However, their collaborative efforts had produced more questions than answers, and the evidence they had gathered painted a picture of a family deeply involved in practices that most respectable citizens would have considered dangerous and possibly blasphemous. The photograph itself remained the center of all these investigations, its enigmatic figures seeming to watch their efforts with malevolent patience. As the days grew shorter and the autumn mists began to gather around Millbrook, those involved in the investigation could not shake the feeling that their probing into matters long buried had awakened something that would have preferred to remain undisturbed. The breakthrough in understanding the Blackwood photograph came from an unexpected source. In late October of 1921, exactly 22 years after the mysterious funeral portrait was taken, for the remainder of his life, convinced that he had unknowingly captured something that defied both natural law and divine order. At Dr. Whitmore's invitation, Mrs. Morrison traveled to Millbrook and agreed to share her father's account of that October evening in 1899. Her revelations proved more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. According to her testimony, Silas Pendleton had not simply stumbled upon supernatural phenomena. He had been deliberately invited to participate in what he later described as an unholy ritual disguised as a funeral service. Mrs. Morrison produced a leather-bound journal that her father had kept hidden during his lifetime, containing detailed entries about the Blackwood assignment. The journal revealed that Ezra Blackwood's death had not been as natural as the official records suggested. Family members had contacted Pendleton specifically because of his reputation for discretion and his willingness to work under unusual circumstances. The journal entries described a family consumed by grief, not just for Ezra's death, but for the earlier loss of Jeremiah Blackwood 32 years prior. According to Pendleton's notes, the surviving family members believed that Jeremiah's spirit had become trapped in a state between life and death, unable to find peace because of his involvement with supernatural experimentation. They had spent decades attempting to communicate with him and help him find rest. Ezra's funeral, as recorded in Pendleton's secret journal, was designed to serve a dual purpose. While appearing to be a conventional memorial service, it was actually intended as an elaborate séance meant to finally free Jeremiah's trapped spirit. The family had arranged the room according to specific ritualistic requirements, using candles, mirrors, and symbolic objects to create what they believed would be a portal between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Most shocking of all was Pendleton's claim that the mysterious figure in the photograph was indeed Jeremiah Blackwood, but not as a simple spirit manifestation. According to the journal, the family believed that Jeremiah's consciousness had become anchored to physical objects associated with it. The mysterious figure had not been visible to the naked eye during the actual session, but that he had sensed something moving in the shadows near the doorway. His professional instincts had told him that his exposure was somehow wrong, that the light in the room was behaving in ways that contradicted his decades of experience. Yet he had completed the photograph as requested, not understanding until later what he had actually captured. Mrs. Morrison's revelations explained many of the technical anomalies that had puzzled the various experts who had examined the photograph. If the image showed not simply a spirit manifestation, but the result of some kind of supernatural energy transfer, it would account for the unusual density patterns, impossible shadow angles, and optical inconsistencies that had defied conventional analysis. However, the journal contained even more disturbing information about the consequences of that October evening. According to Pendleton's entries, the ritual had not achieved its intended purpose of freeing Jeremiah's spirit. Instead, it had somehow strengthened his connection to the physical world, enabling him to manifest more powerfully and with increasing frequency. Family members had begun reporting direct encounters with Jeremiah's presence, encounters that grew more aggressive and demanding over time. Within 6 months of the funeral, 3 of Ezra's 5 children had died under mysterious circumstances. The official records attributed these deaths to natural causes, heart failure, pneumonia, and a farm accident. But Pendleton's journal suggested a more sinister pattern. Each death had been preceded by reports of supernatural encounters and claims that Jeremiah's spirit was demanding some form of payment or sacrifice in exchange for his continued manifestations. The surviving family members had eventually fled Millbrook, selling their property at a significant loss and scattering to distant communities where they hoped to escape whatever malevolent presence they had inadvertently strengthened. Martha Blackwood, the widow, had spent her final years in a Boston sanitarium, reportedly suffering from delusions, and claiming that her brother-in-law's ghost was tormenting her for her role in the failed ritual. As the image existed, the malevolent entity it contained would continue to grow stronger, potentially threatening anyone who came into contact with it. As Mrs. Morrison concluded her testimony, Dr. Whitmore and the other investigators found themselves confronting a possibility that none of them had seriously considered. The Blackwood photograph might not simply be evidence of supernatural phenomena. It might actually be a prison containing a malevolent consciousness that was growing more powerful with each passing year. And their own investigation might have inadvertently strengthened whatever dark force the image contained. The revelation of Silas Pendleton's secret journal fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation surrounding the Blackwood photograph. What had begun as an academic inquiry into a curious historical anomaly had evolved into something far more dangerous and potentially catastrophic. Dr. Whitmore found himself at the center of a crisis that challenged not only his scholarly assumptions, but his basic understanding of reality itself. The first signs of serious trouble began within days of Mrs. Morrison's testimony. Edmund Blackthorne, the paranormal investigator who had been leading the séance sessions, was found dead in his hotel room on November 3, 1921. The local physician determined that he had died of heart failure, but the circumstances surrounding his death were deeply unsettling. Hotel staff reported that his room had been inexplicably cold, despite the heating system functioning normally throughout the building. More disturbing still were the physical evidence found in Blackthorne's room. His research notes were scattered across the floor, as if by a violent windstorm, yet all the windows remained closed and locked. Most ominously, several photographic prints of the Blackwood image were discovered, pinned to the walls, each one showing signs of having been altered by some unknown force. The mysterious figure in the background appeared darker and more defined in these prints than in any previous versions, and witnesses swore they could see malevolent intelligence gleaming in what might have been its eyes. Mrs. Victoria Crow, the medium who had participated in Blackthorne's séances, suffered a complete nervous through endless dark corridors. His colleagues noted a dramatic decline in his mental acuity and physical appearance. By December of 1921, he had taken an extended leave of absence from the university and returned to his family home in Vermont, where he lived as a recluse until his death in 1926. Dr. Weber, the German physicist who had conducted the technical analysis of the photograph, fared no better. He reported that his own scientific instruments had begun malfunctioning whenever he attempted to conduct research unrelated to the Blackwood case. Photographic equipment would produce inexplicably distorted images. Spectrographic devices would register impossible readings, and optical instruments would show phantom figures that existed nowhere except in their lenses. His reputation within the scientific community suffered irreparable damage, as colleagues began to question both his methods and his sanity. As these disturbing events accumulated, Dr. Whitmore realized that the investigation had attracted the attention of authorities far beyond the local academic community. In January of 1922, he was visited by two men who identified themselves as representatives of a special government committee concerned with unusual phenomena that might affect public welfare and national security. They politely but firmly requested that all research related to the Blackwood photograph be discontinued immediately. The government representatives, who declined to provide specific details about their organizational affiliation, made it clear that the investigation had been classified as a matter of national importance. They cited concerns about mass hysteria and social disruption that might result if word of the photograph's alleged supernatural properties became widespread. Dr. Whitmore was ordered to surrender all materials related to the case, including the original photographic plate, all prints and copies, and any research notes or documentation produced during the investigation. However, the government's attempt to suppress information about the Blackwood photograph proved only partially successful. Several of the researchers had already made copies of key documents, and word of the investigation had spread too widely to be completely contained. Local residents continued to report supernatural and unsettling sensation of being watched by unseen observers. When the demolition was finally completed, the crew made a disturbing discovery in the basement of the house. Hidden beneath loose floorboards, they found a collection of photographic plates and equipment that had apparently belonged to Jeremiah Blackwood. Many of the plates showed images similar to the infamous funeral photograph, family gatherings and social events that included mysterious shadow figures positioned at thresholds and doorways. Most unsettling of all was a photographic self-portrait, apparently taken by Jeremiah shortly before his death in 1867. The image showed him seated in what appeared to be his cabin, but reflected in a mirror behind him was a crowd of shadowy figures that seemed to be pressing forward as if trying to escape from the glass itself. Written on the back of the photograph, in Jeremiah's handwriting, was a single sentence: "The door is opening, and I cannot close it again." Government agents arrived within hours of this discovery and confiscated all the materials found in the Blackwood basement. The demolition workers were required to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements, and the story of their find was officially attributed to historical artifacts of no particular significance. However, several of the workers later reported that they continued to experience supernatural encounters for years after the demolition, as if their brief contact with Jeremiah's photographic experiments had somehow marked them for attention by whatever entities he had been attempting to summon. Dr. Whitmore himself began experiencing increasingly severe psychological pressure to abandon his research. He found his academic position at risk, his funding sources mysteriously withdrawn, and his professional reputation under attack from colleagues who had previously respected his work. More personally troubling were the supernatural phenomena that began manifesting in his own home and office. Photographs would develop shadow figures that had not been visible during exposure. Mirrors would reflect rooms that did not match their actual surroundings, and he frequently heard footsteps in empty corridors that seemed to follow him wherever he went. By the summer of 1922, most of the original investigators had either died, suffered complete mental breakdowns, or been 1920s and 30s, not only in Millbrook, but in communities across New England, where copies of the photograph had circulated. These incidents followed a consistent pattern. Individuals who had viewed the image or learned details about its history would begin experiencing supernatural encounters that grew more intense and threatening over time. The pattern of deaths among those who had been involved in the investigation also continued. Mrs. Helena Morrison, Silas Pendleton's daughter, who had revealed the contents of her father's secret journal, died in a house fire in 1924, under circumstances that investigators described as Suspicious, but not conclusively criminal. Dr. Margaret Thornley, the anthropologist from Wellesley College, suffered a severe stroke in 1925 that left her unable to speak or write about her research. Even more disturbing were the reports that began emerging from government sources in the late 1920s. Classified documents, not released until decades later, revealed that special military units had been dispatched to investigate similar photographic anomalies in other locations across the United States. These cases, collectively designated as Project Looking Glass, involved images that seemed to capture supernatural phenomena with the same technical characteristics as the Blackwood photograph. The documents suggested that government researchers had concluded that certain photographic processes, particularly those involving equipment or materials that had been exposed to intensive supernatural activity, could somehow serve as conduits for malevolent entities seeking to manifest in the physical world. The Blackwood case was classified as the first documented instance of what researchers termed anchored manifestation, the use of physical objects to maintain a permanent presence in the material realm. October 27, 1999, exactly 100 years after the Blackwood funeral photograph was taken, Dr. Amanda Richardson, a professor of American history at Boston University, sat in her study, surrounded by photocopied documents, declassified government files, and faded newspaper clippings. She had spent the better part of 3 years researching what had become known in academic circles as the Millbrook Incident, driven supernatural research that had operated for decades beyond public knowledge. These files revealed that the Blackwood photograph had not been an isolated incident, but rather the first in a series of similar cases that had continued well into the mid-20th century. Most disturbing of all were the psychological profiles contained within these classified files. Government researchers had documented a consistent pattern among individuals who had been exposed to what they termed anchored manifestation phenomena. Those who viewed the supernatural photographs or participated in investigations related to them showed significantly higher rates of mental illness, violent behavior, and premature death compared to control groups. The files suggested that whatever entities were captured in these images continued to exert influence over viewers long after initial exposure. Subjects reported persistent nightmares, hallucinations, and the sensation of being watched or followed by invisible presences. Many described feeling compelled to seek out additional supernatural experiences, as if the initial contact had created an addiction to paranormal phenomena. Dr. Richardson had initially approached these reports with the skepticism of a trained historian, assuming that the documented effects could be explained through psychological suggestion and cultural conditioning. However, as her research progressed, she began to experience phenomena that tested her rational explanations. Her first unsettling experience occurred while reviewing photocopied images from the original Blackwood photograph in her university office, late one evening in October of 1998. As she studied the mysterious background figure under bright fluorescent lighting, she became convinced that its position had shifted slightly from previous examinations. She dismissed this as a trick of lighting or fatigue, but the impression was strong enough to make her seek out additional copies of the image for comparison. Over the following months, Dr. Richardson's examination of multiple copies of the Blackwood photograph convinced her that the image was indeed changing in subtle but consistent ways. The shadow figure appeared to be growing darker and more defined with each viewing, as if whatever presence it represented was somehow feeding on the attention it received. More unsettling still, She began to notice that her own photographs' genuine supernatural properties came from an unexpected source. In March of 1999, she received a package containing materials from the estate of Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, who had died the previous winter at the age of 97. Among the documents was a leather journal, similar to the one kept by Silas Pendleton, containing Dr. Whitmore's private thoughts about the investigation he had led 78 years earlier. Whitmore's journal revealed that he had never completely abandoned his research into the Blackwood photograph, despite the official suppression and personal costs of the original investigation. Throughout the decades that followed, he had quietly monitored reports of supernatural phenomena that seemed connected to the case, documenting a pattern of influence that extended far beyond the original participants. According to Whitmore's records, the photograph's influence had continued to spread through what he termed chain transmission. Individuals who learned about the case or viewed copies of the image would become susceptible to supernatural encounters, which would then spread to family members, friends, and colleagues, through a process that resembled psychological contagion, but operated according to rules that defied scientific explanation. Most chilling of all was Whitmore's final entry, written just days before his death. After nearly 8 decades of investigation, he had concluded that the Blackwood photograph represented something far more dangerous than a simple spirit manifestation. In his opinion, the image served as a kind of supernatural beacon, gradually drawing together individuals with latent psychic sensitivity and preparing them for some larger purpose that he could only describe as the gathering of souls for a harvest that should never come to pass. Dr. Richardson closed the journal with trembling hands, finally understanding why so many researchers had chosen to abandon their investigation, despite the compelling nature of the evidence. The Blackwood photograph was not simply a historical curiosity, or even proof of supernatural phenomena. It was an active threat that grew stronger with each person who became aware of its existence. Yet, even with this knowledge, she found herself unable to or continue pursuing answers that might well cost her sanity and possibly her life. Standing in her study on that anniversary night, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of a century-long supernatural conspiracy, she realized that the choice had already been made for her. The photograph's influence had already taken hold. And like Dr. Whitmore and all the others before her, she would continue her investigation until it either revealed its ultimate truth or claimed her as another casualty in a war between worlds that most people would never even know was being fought. The Blackwood funeral photograph continues to exist somewhere in the classified archives of the United States government, officially dismissed as a historical hoax, but privately guarded as one of the most dangerous artifacts in human possession. Those who know of its existence can only hope that the barriers built around it will prove sufficient to contain whatever malevolent intelligence it harbors, until some future generation discovers a means of permanently destroying the link between our world and whatever dark realm seeks to claim it. But on foggy autumn evenings in small New England towns, when the veil between worlds grows thin and shadows seem to move with purposes of their own, some still wonder whether that containment has truly held, or whether the harvest that Jonathan Whitmore feared has already begun, claiming souls one by one in a pattern too subtle for the living world to recognize, until it is far too late to stop.